Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my short series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women who are doing amazing work around the world. My name is Emily Prey and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Clarissa Ward, the chief international correspondent for CNN, about the crisis in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining me, Clarissa.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So in August, in the beginning, a lot of Afghans who worked with the military or embassies or who were journalists were able to get out of the country. Obviously not nearly enough, but many of these people were men who had to leave their families behind, intending to get them back, or send money back to help them. So now there's this whole group of matriarchs in Afghanistan who are trying to keep their families safe and survive in an increasingly hostile landscape with intense restrictions on employment and movement and pretty much everything necessary to having a livelihood. So how are they surviving, and are they surviving?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important when we talk about women in Afghanistan that we don't think of them as being a monolith. They're not, and they have very different experiences of the U.S. Leaving Afghanistan, depending on where they're from in the country. There are many parts of Afghanistan where people were delighted that the U.S. has left, where the security situation is now significantly better, and where women's rights in the context that we think about it in a kind of Western context simply aren't really relevant to their lives, and in many cases aren't appealing or compelling to them. So I just wanted to start out by saying that because it's important to say that. But when you talk about women who live in the cities, for example, women who have had the privilege of education and further education and have really profited from the gains and opportunities that have been open to them over the last 20 years. They are in a pretty desperate situation right now for many reasons, which you just touched on several of them. But in addition to the fact that there is, a political crisis, a security crisis, it is freezing cold, there is no money, there's a terrible economic crisis that is, perhaps the most pronounced crisis of all. They've been told that if they're girls, they can't go to school above fifth grade. If they're women who work for the government, they've been told, for the most part, not in every case, to stay at home. And many of them are fearful for how they're going to survive, how they're going to take care of their family, and what kind of a legacy or life they are going to be passing on to their daughters.
I really appreciate you raising that first point about how Afghan women are not a monolithic group. And it reminds me of Shahrazad Akbar was on Gendering Geopolitics several months ago, back in the spring. And one of the most important things that she said, I think, is that Afghan women are not a homogenous group, exactly what you were saying, but that is the way that we talk about them often. So it's an important reminder. So thank you for that. My next question is about the healthcare situation in Afghanistan, particularly for pregnant women and for newborn children. Another guest of Gendering Geopolitics, Jane Ferguson, recently wrote an article where she zoomed in on one of these crises about the horrible situation for newborn mothers and how malnourishment and disease are just rampant in hospitals and clinics throughout the country, and supplies are nearly non-existent. And in one of the ICUs that she visited, 1/3 of all children who arrive there don't survive. So what does this tell you about the future of Afghanistan and the generation that is growing up under this new Taliban rule?
So again, one important thing to sort of mention from the outset is that this was always a problem in Afghanistan, particularly infant mortality, mothers dying in childbirth. This has been a really serious problem for many, many years. That said, we're definitely seeing a noted deterioration beyond what was already a very bad situation. And there's a number of reasons for that, but particularly it's because the healthcare system is starting to unravel. There are a number of sanctions, of course, against the Taliban. Aid has been frozen. The central bank's assets have been frozen. And what that means is that the Taliban can't really function as a government in terms of paying civil servants' salaries. So you're seeing a lot of the sort of primary healthcare just collapsing, thereby overwhelming secondary and tertiary healthcare, which has a knock-on effect across the whole sector and means that a situation that was already very bad has now become dire. And so, the heartbreaking thing about that is that I don't see, from my limited vantage point, any way out of that situation, because the major press that we're seeing now, or push for aid, that's emergency aid to stop people from starving to death, to get them through this winter. But we don't yet see any sense of real resolution in terms of how to deal with the broader issue of sanctions on Afghanistan. Of course, the US government and other Western governments are in a really difficult position because, what kind of a message does it send if they immediately start cooperating with the Taliban, even though the Taliban's not letting girls go to school? So they are in a difficult position in terms of finding a balance. But there's no question that the sanctions and the freezing of aid as it stands, despite some efforts, is having a major debilitating effect on the healthcare system, and certainly maternal care is feeling that pretty intensely.
So you've mentioned the economic crisis that Afghanistan is facing, and it is truly just horrific. But how can Afghanistan rebuild its economy when the majority of its economy came from overseas funding for the last 2 decades?
Um, it can't really. As things stand, it can't. There is no way. I mean, there's several factors to take into consideration. One, as you just mentioned, like Afghanistan has been reliant on international aid for a long time. And and there's a huge war economy that existed for many years in Afghanistan, which no longer really exists. Also, if you look at the Taliban, while they've been able to provide some security, they've tried to keep a lot of these sort of the infrastructure and the day-to-day life moving and continuing. What they don't have at all are technocrats. What they don't have is economic expertise. And thirdly, even if they did have that economic expertise, or they were willing to have a more inclusive government that sort of brings in more technocrats into the fold, they don't have access to the assets of the central bank. And so, unless you see a lifting or a kind of shifting or some kind of an amalgamation of the sanctions that currently exist, it's impossible to see how Afghanistan could really begin to build its economy. And that's the whole point of sanctions, though, right? And it's the whole point of freezing aid, is you're using that as leverage, if you're the Biden administration, to try to extract certain important concessions from the Taliban.
Now, I don't like to ask this next question, but it comes from a sense of incredible frustration that I'm sure many people feel as they've seen how world leaders have reacted to the situation there over the last several months. But what was the point, in your opinion, of the last 20 years of investments by the US and by its NATO allies into women's rights, into healthcare, infrastructure, and education? What was the point of all of that when it seems that everyone is just sitting back and watching everything that was built crumble?
I think you do have to ask yourself one thing, as an American, for example, because when I sit with women now in Afghanistan and their hearts are broken because they had this moment, they had this opportunity, they went to college, they hosted a television show, they became an MP, they became a judge, they started to really participate in civic life. And in a matter of moments, that disappeared. And now they have to explain to their daughters why you can't go to school anymore, why you can't have those dreams that they were allowed to have anymore. And so you ask yourself, is that a better or worse situation to be in than another woman in Helmand province, let's say, in southern Afghanistan, who was never really encouraged by her community to even dream or hope about things like getting a substantive education, or having some kind of a career, or playing some major role in civic life, because she has basically been told since birth what her life will look like. And as a result, the disappointment is probably less bitter. Whereas I do feel acutely for so many educated women in Afghanistan now who see their lives changing for the worse, almost certainly forever. And you think to yourselves, do you bear a responsibility as a country like America or like the UK or some of the other NATO allies who are involved for giving them that hope and making those promises and opening this door to a world that is now firmly closed. And I don't have the answer to that, but I definitely think it's a question, that ultimately Afghan women have to answer for themselves. But it is one that has kept me up at night.
And just before we run out of time, if you could speak to President Biden, what would your 3 recommendations for Afghanistan be?
I mean, it's never for me as a journalist to prescribe policy, and I know that President Biden has some tremendous expertise and on his team. The only one real piece of advice I would have would be that Afghanistan, even though it's over, even though the extraction is complete or largely complete, Afghanistan still needs to be on the US's agenda. And I do think that there is a sense, not just from a point of view of having some kind of an obligation or a responsibility to continue to care about and engage with the fate of Afghan people, but also even from a security point of view that, there are a lot of factors happening right now that could create a really dangerous environment. And so whether continued sanctions are the policy or whether they're not, I just would very much hope that this continues to be at the forefront of the administration's foreign policy decision making as they go through the rest of this term.
Thank you so much for coming on Generating Geopolitics, Clarissa. Thank you so much for your time and for your comments on the situation in Afghanistan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emily.